Chemical weapons have a long, dark history, stretching from ancient times to the modern battlefield. Their use as a tactical instrument of war fundamentally changed human conflict, introducing a new level of fear and devastation. In ancient warfare, rudimentary forms of chemical agents were already being used. For instance, the Spartans employed burning sulfur and pitch to create toxic fumes during sieges. The Greeks and Romans also reportedly used a type of primitive chemical warfare by poisoning water supplies and using incendiary devices that produced harmful smoke. However, the true genesis of modern chemical warfare came with the advent of industrial chemistry in the 19th century. As nations developed chemical industries, the potential for using toxic chemicals as weapons became more apparent. The rise of chemistry as a discipline coincided with military ambitions to use science to gain an upper hand in warfare. By the late 1800s, European powers, particularly Germany, were actively experimenting with chemical agents that could incapacitate or kill enemy forces. The tipping point in chemical warfare came during World War I in 1915. The German army unleashed chlorine gas on French and Algerian soldiers at the Battle of Ypres, marking the first major use of chemical weapons in modern warfare. This initial attack was followed by the deployment of even more deadly chemicals, such as phosgene and mustard gas. These gases inflicted a horrific toll on soldiers, causing chemical burns, blindness, and fatal damage to the respiratory system. The psychological impact of chemical warfare was equally profound. Soldiers lived in constant fear of sudden gas attacks, a terror that compounded the physical agony they endured. The widespread use of chemical weapons in World War I led to an international outcry, culminating in the signing of the Geneva Protocol in 1925, which prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. Although the Geneva Protocol was a significant step, it did not prevent countries from continuing to research and stockpile chemical weapons. During World War II, both the Axis and Allied powers produced large quantities of chemical weapons, though they were not used on the battlefield to the same extent as in World War I. The Cold War, however, saw a renewed focus on chemical weapons, particularly with the development of nerve agents like sarin, tabun, and VX. These chemicals, far deadlier than those used in World War I, posed an even greater threat. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union included the production of vast chemical weapons stockpiles, which remained a central component of military strategy throughout the Cold War. In the latter half of the 20th century, efforts to ban chemical weapons gained traction, culminating in the Chemical Weapons Convention, (CWC), in 1993. This landmark treaty, which has been signed by 193 countries, prohibits the production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons, and mandates the destruction of existing arsenals. Despite this progress, chemical weapons continue to pose a threat, with several nations still suspected of harboring stockpiles or developing new agents. Moreover, non-state actors, including terrorist groups, have attempted to acquire chemical weapons, further complicating global efforts to eradicate their use. The evolution of chemical weapons reveals a disturbing progression from rudimentary poisonings to industrial-scale mass destruction. From the gas clouds that choked soldiers in World War I to the nerve agents designed during the Cold War, chemical warfare has left a lasting scar on the history of human conflict. While treaties like the Geneva Protocol and the CWC represent significant milestones, the challenge of completely eradicating chemical weapons remains a critical issue for global security in the 21st century. Chemical weapons are categorized as weapons of mass destruction due to their ability to incapacitate or kill large numbers of people in a short time. Unlike conventional weapons, which rely on explosive force, chemical weapons depend on the toxic properties of chemical agents to cause harm. The science behind these weapons lies in their ability to target biological systems, often by disrupting critical processes in the human body. Understanding the chemistry of these agents is crucial to comprehending their devastating effects on both individuals and the environment. Chemical agents are divided into several categories based on their physiological effects. These include blister agents, vesicants, nerve agents, choking agents, blood agents, and incapacitating agents. Each class of chemical weapon affects the body in a unique way, but all share the common goal of causing debilitating injury or death. Blister agents, also known as vesicants, blister agents such as sulfur mustard gas, and lewisite are designed to cause severe chemical burns on the skin and mucous membranes. Upon contact, these agents react with cellular structures, breaking down tissues and leading to painful blisters. Inhalation of vesicants can damage the respiratory tract, resulting in internal bleeding, respiratory failure, or long-term lung damage. Mustard gas, widely used in World War I, earned its notorious reputation for its ability to incapacitate soldiers without immediate symptoms. Victims often did not realize they were exposed until hours later when the painful blisters began to form. This delayed effect made mustard gas particularly insidious, as it allowed large numbers of soldiers to be exposed before protective measures could be taken. Nerve agents. Among the deadliest chemical weapons are nerve agents like sarin, VX, and tabun. These chemicals are organophosphates that interfere with the normal functioning of the nervous system by inhibiting the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. This enzyme is responsible for breaking down acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter that controls muscle movement. When nerve agents inhibit acetylcholinesterase, acetylcholine accumulates in the synapses between nerve cells, causing continuous stimulation of muscles. Victims of nerve agent exposure often experience muscle twitching, convulsions, loss of bodily control, and ultimately respiratory failure. Nerve agents are lethal even in small quantities and can be delivered through aerosols, liquids, or vapors. The swift onset of symptoms, combined with the potency of these agents, makes them particularly dangerous in both military and terrorist contexts. Choking agents. Chemical agents like chlorine and phosgene fall into the category of choking agents, which attack the respiratory system. These gases are typically heavier than air, allowing them to linger in trenches or low-lying areas where they can be inhaled. Upon exposure, choking agents damage the alveoli, the tiny air sacs in the lungs where oxygen exchange occurs. This damage leads to fluid buildup in the lungs, a condition known as pulmonary edema. Victims often drown in their own bodily fluids within hours of exposure, as their ability to breathe is compromised. Chlorine gas, the first chemical weapon used in large-scale warfare during World War I, produces a distinct yellow-green cloud and a strong, acrid odor. Its psychological impact was almost as devastating as its physical effects, with soldiers fearing the characteristic gas clouds even before symptoms began. Blood agents such as hydrogen cyanide and cyanogen chloride work by interfering with the body's ability to use oxygen. These agents prevent cells from performing cellular respiration, effectively starving them of the oxygen needed to produce energy. Exposure to blood agents leads to symptoms such as dizziness, shortness of breath, convulsions, and cardiac arrest. Hydrogen cyanide, once used in Nazi gas chambers during World War II, can be lethal within minutes of inhalation due to its rapid disruption of cellular processes. Though less common than nerve or blister agents, blood agents are no less lethal and have been weaponized in various forms throughout history. Incapacitating agents. Some chemical weapons are designed not to kill but to disable their targets temporarily. These incapacitating agents include substances like tear gas, CS gas, and pepper spray, which cause irritation of the eyes, respiratory system, and skin. While generally considered non-lethal, tear gas can cause serious harm at high concentrations or with prolonged exposure. Riot control agents like these are often used by law enforcement during protests, but their use in warfare is restricted under international law. In some cases, more potent incapacitating agents, such as BZ, have been developed. BZ is a hallucinogenic chemical that causes disorientation, confusion, and loss of bodily control, making it a potential weapon for incapacitating large groups of people without causing fatalities. The delivery methods of chemical weapons are as varied as the agents themselves. Chemical munitions can be deployed through artillery shells, bombs, rockets, and even aerosol sprays. In some cases, chemicals are released as gases, while in others, they are deployed as liquids or powders that can contaminate the air, water, or ground. The method of delivery plays a crucial role in the weapon's effectiveness. For example, nerve agents like VX are more effective when deployed as a vapor or aerosol, allowing them to be inhaled or absorbed through the skin. Once released, chemical agents can persist in the environment for varying amounts of time, depending on factors such as temperature, humidity, and the chemical's volatility. Some agents, like sarin, dissipate quickly, while others, like mustard gas, can linger in the environment, contaminating water and soil for days or even weeks. The long-term environmental effects of chemical weapons can be devastating, particularly in agricultural regions where contamination can render land unusable for years. In summary, the science behind chemical weapons reveals a sophisticated and lethal form of warfare. The development of these agents, which target vital biological systems, has led to some of the most horrifying weapons ever used in human conflict. Understanding the chemistry and physiological impact of these agents is key to both mitigating their effects and developing countermeasures to protect against their use. The use of chemical weapons in modern warfare has evolved significantly since the early 20th century. Despite international agreements banning their use, these weapons have reappeared in numerous conflicts, often with devastating consequences. The shift from large-scale deployment during World War I to more targeted, strategic use in contemporary conflicts reflects both technological advancements and the changing nature of warfare. Chemical weapons, once a staple of industrial-era warfare, are now often used as tools of terror, psychological warfare, and repression, with profound implications for global security and humanitarian law. World War I marked the first widespread use of chemical weapons on the battlefield, with both sides deploying gas attacks to break the stalemate of trench warfare. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas were among the most notorious agents used, causing mass casualties and psychological trauma. The sheer scale of chemical warfare during World War I led to the signing of the Geneva Protocol in 1925, which banned the use of chemical and biological weapons in conflict. Despite this treaty, research and development of chemical weapons continued throughout the 20th century, driven by both the perceived military utility of these weapons and the arms race between superpowers. During World War II, chemical weapons were stockpiled by both the Axis and Allied powers, though they were not used to the same extent as in the First World War. The primary reason for their limited use was the fear of retaliation in kind, as all major powers had chemical arsenals at their disposal. However, the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany, including the use of hydrogen cyanide, Zyklon B, in concentration camps, underscored the deadly potential of chemical agents. Although these actions did not occur on the battlefield, they highlighted the ability of chemical weapons to be used for mass extermination and terror. The Cold War period saw significant advancements in chemical weaponry, particularly in the development of nerve agents like sarin, tabun, and VX. These agents were far more lethal than the gases used in World War I, capable of causing death even in minuscule doses. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in an arms race that included the production and stockpiling of vast quantities of chemical weapons. While nuclear weapons dominated Cold War strategic thinking, chemical weapons were seen as a potential tool for both tactical and psychological warfare. The risk of chemical warfare was a constant concern, particularly in the event of a conventional war in Europe. Despite the development of international treaties aimed at limiting chemical weapons, their use persisted into the late 20th century and beyond. One of the most notorious modern uses of chemical weapons occurred during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, when the Iraqi government, under Saddam Hussein, deployed chemical agents such as mustard gas and sarin against Iranian forces and Kurdish civilians. The 1988 attack on the Kurdish town of Halabja, in which thousands of civilians were killed or injured by chemical bombs, is one of the most infamous examples of chemical warfare in the post-World War II era. This incident not only demonstrated the horrific effects of chemical weapons on civilians but also exposed the limitations of international enforcement mechanisms. In the 21st century, chemical weapons have been used sporadically in various conflicts, often by state actors seeking to maintain control over populations or by non-state actors seeking to terrorize civilians. One of the most alarming examples has been the repeated use of chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011. The Syrian government, under President Bashar al-Assad, has been accused of using sarin, chlorine gas, and other chemical agents against rebel-held areas, resulting in significant civilian casualties. The 2013 Ghouta chemical attack, which killed hundreds of people, drew international condemnation and led to the Syrian government agreeing to join the Chemical Weapons Convention and destroy its chemical arsenal. However, reports of continued chemical attacks in Syria, despite international oversight, highlight the ongoing challenges in preventing the use of these weapons. The use of chemical weapons by non-state actors, particularly terrorist groups, represents another significant threat in modern times. Groups like ISIS have been accused of deploying chlorine gas and other chemical agents in Iraq and Syria. The potential for terrorist organizations to acquire and use chemical weapons poses a grave security risk, as these weapons can be deployed with relatively low cost and technological expertise compared to other weapons of mass destruction. The ability of such groups to spread fear and chaos using chemical agents, even on a small scale, remains a concern for governments and international organizations. The international community's response to chemical weapons use in modern warfare has been shaped by the framework of the Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, which came into force in 1997. The CWC prohibits the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons and mandates the destruction of existing arsenals. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, the body responsible for overseeing the implementation of the CWC, has been instrumental in verifying the destruction of declared chemical stockpiles and investigating allegations of chemical weapons use. However, enforcement remains a challenge, particularly in conflict zones where access is limited and non-compliance is difficult to monitor. Despite these efforts, the threat posed by chemical weapons has not been fully eradicated. In addition to state actors that may still harbor chemical weapons, the risk of proliferation to non-state actors and rogue regimes remains a serious concern. The use of chemical weapons as a tool of terror or repression, rather than as a conventional military weapon, highlights the evolving nature of chemical warfare in the modern era. As technology advances and new chemical agents are developed, the international community must remain vigilant in its efforts to prevent the re-emergence of chemical warfare on a large scale. In conclusion, while international treaties and agreements have reduced the use of chemical weapons in traditional warfare, these weapons continue to pose a significant threat in modern conflicts. The evolution of chemical weapons from tools of battlefield dominance to instruments of terror and repression reflects both the enduring appeal of these weapons to certain actors and the challenges of enforcing global bans. The repeated use of chemical agents in conflicts like the Syrian civil war and their potential use by terrorist organizations underscore the importance of ongoing vigilance, diplomacy, and international cooperation to prevent the further spread and use of chemical weapons in the 21st century. The deployment of chemical weapons inflicts long-lasting harm, not only on human populations but also on the environment. While their immediate effects are often catastrophic, the long-term consequences can persist for decades, leaving deep scars on ecosystems, infrastructure, and the fabric of societies. This chapter explores the severe humanitarian impact chemical weapons have on individuals, communities, and entire regions, as well as the often overlooked environmental devastation that follows their use. Humanitarian impact chemical weapons are designed to cause indiscriminate harm, meaning they do not distinguish between combatants and civilians. One of the most troubling aspects of chemical warfare is its capacity to incapacitate or kill people in horrific ways. Victims suffer agonizing symptoms that can last for hours, days, or even result in long-term disabilities. For example, mustard gas, one of the most widely used chemical agents, causes severe blistering of the skin, mucous membranes, and respiratory tract. Even a small amount of exposure can lead to excruciating burns, blindness, and long-term respiratory problems. Survivors often live with chronic pain, disfigurement, and reduced quality of life, as mustard gas leaves deep physical and psychological scars. Nerve agents, such as sarin or VX, act quickly to disrupt the nervous system, leading to paralysis, convulsions, and eventually death by asphyxiation. Those who survive exposure often suffer from long-term neurological damage, including cognitive impairment, muscle weakness, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The psychological toll of chemical attacks can be immense, as survivors live in constant fear of future attacks and struggle to cope with the traumatic memories of witnessing friends, family members, and neighbors succumb to these invisible killers. The humanitarian crisis is magnified when chemical weapons are used in densely populated civilian areas. In conflicts such as the Syrian civil war, entire towns have been subjected to chemical bombardment, leaving hospitals overwhelmed and medical personnel unprepared to treat the flood of casualties. Unlike conventional weapons, the effects of chemical agents can take time to manifest, creating chaos and confusion among first responders who often lack proper protective equipment. Emergency services are frequently ill-equipped to decontaminate affected areas, exacerbating the spread of harmful chemicals. The displacement of populations is another major humanitarian consequence. Areas contaminated by chemical weapons often become uninhabitable, forcing civilians to flee their homes and livelihoods. This results in large numbers of internally displaced people and refugees, placing enormous strain on neighboring regions and countries. Chemical weapons exacerbate already dire humanitarian situations, adding to the complexity of providing aid, medical care, and resettlement support to those affected. The environmental devastation. The environmental impact of chemical weapons can be as devastating as their humanitarian toll, affecting air, water, soil, and biodiversity. Some chemical agents, like mustard gas, have a persistence that allows them to contaminate the environment for extended periods. Once released into the atmosphere, chemical agents may settle on the ground or in bodies of water, causing long-term ecological damage. Soil contamination. Many chemical agents, particularly vesicants like mustard gas and certain nerve agents, can bind to soil particles, remaining active for weeks or months. This contamination renders the land toxic and unsuitable for agriculture. Farmers are often forced to abandon fields contaminated by chemical weapons, leading to food shortages and economic collapse in affected regions. Even after decontamination efforts, these areas may require years of environmental rehabilitation before they can safely be cultivated again. Water pollution. Chemical weapons can leach into groundwater and contaminate rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. Once chemical agents enter water systems, they can cause widespread harm to both humans and wildlife. Drinking water supplies become toxic, making it difficult for affected populations to access clean water for cooking, drinking, and sanitation. Contaminated water bodies also have devastating effects on aquatic life. Fish, amphibians, and other water-dependent species are highly susceptible to chemical exposure, leading to mass die-offs that disrupt the ecosystem's balance. The loss of biodiversity, combined with the poisoning of water sources, often leads to long-term ecological destruction. Air pollution. Gases like chlorine, phosgene, and nerve agents spread quickly through the air, making them particularly dangerous in urban areas. When chemical weapons are deployed, they contaminate the air that people breathe, causing respiratory failure and long-term lung diseases in survivors. In war zones, chemical weapons can also exacerbate existing pollution problems caused by the destruction of industrial infrastructure, spreading toxic chemicals even further. The environmental degradation caused by chemical warfare is compounded by the difficulty in cleaning up contaminated areas. Decontamination efforts are time-consuming, expensive, and dangerous, requiring specialized equipment and trained personnel. For countries that have experienced chemical warfare, the economic burden of environmental rehabilitation often stretches into the billions of dollars, further straining post-conflict recovery. Long-term effects on health and society. The health effects of chemical weapons exposure extend far beyond the immediate aftermath of an attack. Survivors often face chronic medical issues that require long-term care, further burdening already strained healthcare systems. Respiratory diseases, skin disorders, neurological impairments, and cancers linked to chemical exposure can persist for years, sometimes manifesting decades after the initial exposure. In addition to physical health problems, the mental health impact of chemical weapons is profound. Survivors and their families frequently suffer from PTSD, anxiety, and depression. The trauma of witnessing mass casualties, combined with the fear of future chemical attacks, creates a pervasive sense of insecurity. Communities torn apart by chemical warfare often struggle to rebuild social cohesion, as the psychological scars can hinder efforts at reconciliation and recovery. The socio-economic consequences are also significant. Chemical attacks disrupt local economies, displace populations, and lead to the loss of livelihoods. Farmers, for example, cannot return to contaminated land, and businesses in affected areas may shut down permanently. The long-term economic impact often stifles development, trapping communities in cycles of poverty and dependency on humanitarian aid. International aid and rehabilitation challenges. The international response to chemical weapons attacks often involves a combination of humanitarian aid, medical assistance, and environmental cleanup efforts. Organizations like the Red Cross, the World Health Organization, WHO, and the United Nations play a crucial role in coordinating relief efforts, but they face immense challenges in delivering aid to conflict zones. One of the most pressing issues is the lack of preparedness for large-scale chemical attacks. Many countries, particularly in the developing world, lack the necessary medical infrastructure and expertise to deal with chemical casualties. Providing appropriate medical care requires specialized knowledge, equipment, and antidotes, which are often in short supply in war-torn areas. Decontaminating affected areas and disposing of chemical agents also requires significant resources, expertise, and time. In regions where chemical attacks have occurred, long-term recovery requires substantial international investment in rebuilding infrastructure, rehabilitating the environment, and providing healthcare to survivors. However, political instability and ongoing conflict often hamper these efforts, leaving communities vulnerable to future attacks and further environmental degradation.